Hi guys, this is Ingvar. Yeah, been a bit busy the last few days, especially with the Pro Chess League, where I am running the Reykjavik Puffins. So lagging a bit on the Tata Steel videos, and while that has been going on, Shakir Mamedyarov has been on an absolute tear. He's just winning game after game. We're going to start here in the 5th round, and it's Mamedyarov with white against Caruana. Now Shak opened with a d4. We have knight f6 by black, c4, e6. Gives black a lot of options. You can go for the Nimso, the Queen's Indian, and in some cases d5. And after knight f3, he didn't go for the Queen's Indian, he went d5. Bishop d5 by white, and bishop b4. Here the most topical move is knight to c3. But seems that Shak wanted to avoid, intense theoretical battles and went with knight b to d2. Which is slightly less common. D takes on c4, e3, intending to win the pawn with a bishop, but black elects to hold on to it with a b5. And for the moment, Shak ignores the pawn deficit, plays bishop e2 just to get castled. Bishop e7 by black, and both sides get castled. And now b3, challenging the pawn on c4. Now this can't be played as a gambit. Black could potentially take on b3. In which case we take with the queen. And okay, we have some compensation. b5 is weak. You have to do something about the bishop. And if you want to keep the pawn, you probably have to take on d2. And then after you keep the pawn, white has some compensation, especially with a strong black squared bishop. And there's, easily pressure on the c file, etc. So such positions are usually quite okay for white. So in the game, Caruana went for c3, which looks like the most critical. It keeps the pawn, attacks the knight, and if the knight has the move, black is doing fine. But white has the intermediate move a3 here, hitting the bishop. If you take on d2 now, I take on b4, and I'm happy. So Caruana retreated, bishop to e7. And now knight b1. The knight will take the pawn on c3. And there's nothing black can do about that. He played c5, immediately challenging the center. And knight takes c3. Caruana decided to protect the pawn on b5, which was under attack. Shak took on c5. And queen c2. So this has the potential to be a somewhat equal game. The pawn structure on the king side is completely symmetrical, as you can see. This is e6, f7, h7 versus e3, and the same for white. And if white were to play b4, we have the same structure on the queen side. But it seemed like on this day both sides were up for a game. After rook after d1, black could play queen e7, get off the pin on the d file, but he went for rook c8. So full credit to Caruana for wanting a game, because now we get an imbalance because of these two pins. White can take on f6, and neither piece can take on f6. If the knight takes, the queen drops, and if the queen takes, the knight drops. So black is forced to take with a pawn, and now you have this damaged structure, but as compensation, black has the bishop here. Now b4 by Mamedyarov, bishop e7, rook a to c1. Black decides to get off the pin on the d file. Black does the same on the c file. This frees the knight to move at some point. Knight to b6. And knight to d4. A nice square for the knight. Especially since black can't really kick it. Once you kick it. Can I kick it? Yes, you can. No, actually, it can't, because I get the great f5 square. So these pawns kind of have to stay where they are. Otherwise, you leave too many weaknesses behind. King h8. This introduces some ideas of using the g file, perhaps in cooperation with the bishop. But white neutralizes the diagonal immediately with bishop to f3. And in doing so, he also neutralizes the advantage of the two bishops. So black doesn't have that anymore. However, he does have the c4 square, and he jumps immediately into that square, hitting the pawn on a3. But white goes knight to e4. So okay, natural question, what happens if we take on a3? Well, white can play queen a1. This hits the knight and also hits f6. So if knight back to c4, there is knight takes f6. And this, my friends, is not good for black. Attack on the queen. Once the queen lands on f6, we can quickly introduce other pieces into the attack. And that's going to be game over. So this pawn can't be taken. Queen c6 instead from Caruana. Knight f to d2. And still we have a game that should be dynamically equal. I mean, both sides have their trumps. So nobody has been outplayed yet. So it's a tense struggle, and it seems like both sides wants to play for a win. Queen to b7, and now knight takes c4. Caruana took with the rook. After rook takes, pawn takes. So now, yeah, we see that white has the much better structure. The black pawns are kind of weak, but black is banking on this c pawn. If white can win it, he's doing very well. If black can hold on to it, it might become a trump. Rook c8, Donald Trump even. We're gonna build a wall. h3. Okay, prophylactic move, clearing the first rank. Queen c6, rook d4, attacking the pawn horizontally. Note that the pawn can't move to c3 because then immediately the rook comes to d3, and white has 3 attackers on the pawn will drop. So for now the pawn has to stay there. a5 by Caruana, and now knight d2. And perhaps around these parts things are starting to fall apart for black. He would like to take on b4 at some point, but he can't because of the threat of rook takes c4. So perhaps a natural question is, what happens if we play c3? We couldn't before, but here the answer is very sneaky. Rook to h4 with an attack here. f5 must be played, and now rook c4. And now we see why we went with rook to h4. We opened this diagonal. So if the queen moves, let's say to d7, b7, there's queen takes c3, Czechoslovakia, and then we take this. Game over. Very sneaky by Mamedyarov. And this explains why Caruana went with rook g8. He was so flustered that his arrow was off, but black is threatening mate on g2. That's easily fixed with g3. But now white is winning a pawn. The queen is attacked. We can take on b4 next. And black went with b3. So he wants white to have an a pawn instead of a b pawn. Knight takes b3. Queen to f3. Hoping for some counterplay against the king side. We do have a rook here, and once we introduce a bishop, there could be some danger on g3. But Czech doesn't mind. He plays a4. Bishop d6. And rook c8. Neutralizing the rook. Note that there's no time for bishop takes g3. Quickly have a look at that. We will flick in a check on g8, and then we will take the piece. And you would have to take here, because once you take on g3, I have a queen g2 pinning the queen, and the a pawn forces the issue. So after rook c8, we saw rook takes c8 by Caruana, king g7. Perhaps now you have ideas of taking on g3, so the queen pulled back to c2 with the same idea of queen to g2, pinning if you take on g3. Bishop b4, queen attacks the bishop, but now soon the a pawn will start running a5, immediately to a6, and white just has beautiful coordination. Queen is covering the pawn, covering the knight, and soon knight is ready to join the party after queen to b6, knight d4. The knight is heading for greener pastures, such as c6, b5, depending on what happens in the game. After queen a5, we saw a quiet move by Czech, king g2, and the king will be very safe on this diagonal once you get the queen there. So queen a3, queen c6, and we see that the queen is ready to go to b7. From there, we're covering the diagonal. There are no checks on the king on the diagonal, and the pawn can simply start running. Queen b7, knight b5, a7, a8. Nothing to be done, so Caruana resigned. So this set Shaq up nicely. He joined the leader group after the 5 rounds and started his killing spree. One man, one spree. He's on fire. So I'll see you in the next one.